Have you ever thought about learning to fly a tailwheel aircraft? Or maybe you flew one long ago and would like to do a little review? If so, stick around as CFI Jim Hopp talks about what you need to know about transitioning into these fun planes. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 345, we talked with listener Jim about a prop strike incident that occurred as he landed his Cessna 182, and we analyzed the flight data to determine the cause. So if you'd like to hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/345. And if you've just found this show for the first time, welcome. And on whatever app you're using now, touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Spotify or Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. Coming up in the news for the week of August 19th, 2024, we have two stories of pilots who crashed without pilot certificates. The FAA is concerned about cracks in Cirrus SR power levers, and we'll tell you how a controller in Australia missed seeing a stolen helicopter take off. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, racing driver Scott Bloomquist dies in Cub crash. A man killed in the crash of a J3 Cub in Tennessee last week does not appear to have had a pilot certificate. There's a lot of attention on the mishap because that person was Scott Bloomquist, 60, a famous dirt track racing driver, considered by many to be the best at the sport. In a 2023 interview with Dale Earnhardt Jr., he said he learned to fly from his father, soloed at 16, and failed at his first attempt to get a certificate. He did not pursue it after that, but continued to fly. He also gave a video tour of the family hangar on their property in Mooresburg, Tennessee. Both the FAA and NTSB are investigating. According to initial report, Bloomquist died when the Cub crashed into a barn on the family property. The crash occurred at 7:15 a.m., and there are no listings in his name on the FAA Air Registry, nor is there a J3 Cub registered in his name. And from BozemanDailyChronicle.com, a Melville pastor who died in a plane crash had no pilot license. The 77-year-old Sweetgrass County, Montana pastor who piloted a plane that crashed on August 10th did not have a valid pilot certificate at the time of the crash, according to FAA records. The pastor of the Melville Lutheran Church died after his 1946 Aircoupe 415C aircraft crashed about 1 p.m. on August 10th in Illinois. The crash occurred under unknown circumstances, according to FAA records. Bill Donald, a member of the church, said the pilot's wife was the only person who knew he was going to buy the plane, explaining that the pastor took a trip to purchase the aircraft that he crashed in. A record of a public sale listing shows that airplane listed for sale for $30,000 in Big Rapids, Michigan. Donald said the pastor loved flying, flew since he was 18, and owned an airplane most of his life. He felt lost without his airplane and wanted to get back into it. From globalair.com, FAA issues ACS over Cirrus SR series power lever cracks and failure. The FAA issued an airworthiness concern sheet, or ACS, after receiving a report of a power lever failure on a Cirrus SR-20. At this time, the FAA is seeking more information on damaged cracks or known failures for Cirrus SR-20, 22, and 22T planes that will be helpful with the evaluation. While advancing to full throttle in preparation for takeoff, the power lever sheared and the pilot cut fuel to the aircraft and aborted takeoff. The fleet operator then requested an inspection of the remainder of their aircraft and found cracks in 24 of the levers through visual and dye-penetrant inspections. The time in service for the fleet ranged from 2,900 to 3,900 hours. These aircraft were used in a training environment and had an average of 12,000 to 15,000 landings. The failure and cracks were found to occur at the region of the lever with the smallest cross-section. And also from globalair.com, Citation jets crashed twice in the past week, killing 2 in Texas. 2 Cessna Citation jets crashed in 2 different states, killing 2 and injuring 2 others. In Washington, North Carolina, a Citation 680 Sovereign, November 680 SA, took off from the Goldsboro Wayne Municipal Airport, GWW, on Sunday with a pilot and co-pilot on board. The FAA said the plane landed and veered off the runway into the grass, catching fire. WITN-7 reported that an airport employee helped the first responders to contain the fire and was injured but treated and later released from the hospital. The pilot and co-pilot were uninjured, but the plane was destroyed in the fire. And earlier this week on Tuesday in Odessa, Texas, at 7 a.m., a Cessna 550 Citation 2, November 689, Victor Papa took off from the Odessa field, that's Oscar Delta Oscar, and struck a power line, continuing southbound until it crashed into a private alley, hitting several homes and sheds. The Texas Department of Public Safety reported that the plane was flying at a low altitude before clipping the power line. Hector County Sheriff Mike Griffiths said witnesses saw the plane struggling to gain altitude, and he said the pilot was likely attempting to avoid the houses. The 48-year-old pilot of Bel Air, Texas, and a 49-year-old woman of Orange, Texas, were pronounced dead at the scene. According to Houston Public Media, the pilot was the president and CEO of a Pasadena-based company, and the woman was a senior administration manager at the company. And one of the causes we've seen of these kinds of takeoff crashes in citations in the past is failure to turn off the parking brake before takeoff. From dailymail.co.uk, a New York businessman has been killed in a helicopter crash after wasps built a nest in the gas tank vent, causing the engine to sputter and plummet from the sky. The pilot, age 65, from Carthage, New York, was at the controls of his private Schweitzer 269C helicopter when disaster struck just 15 minutes into flight on July 27th. The crash occurred at around 11:15 a.m., leaving Johnson seriously injured. He was taken to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Investigators identified the culprit as a nest built by mud dauber wasps inside the chopper's gas tank vent tube. The wasp caused this helicopter to sputter and fall out of the sky, killing Johnson. The helicopter plunged into a marsh from 50 feet in the air, crashing behind a commercial property he was developing about 70 miles northeast of Syracuse. The NTSB report released on August 2nd said that while 11 gallons of fuel were found in the tank, it flowed sporadically, consistent with a lack of venting. NTSB investigator in charge, Robert Gretz, wrote, "After all the fuel was drained, the metal fuel vent tube was examined with a borescope, and a blockage was observed in the tube. The vent tube was then removed from the tank, and the debris was removed using compressed air and a metal wire. The blockage was later confirmed to be consistent with a mud dauber nest." Johnson hadn't flown his Schweitzer helicopter for 3 weeks prior to the fatal crash, his brother told investigators. Mud daubers, dark-colored wasps, known for building nests in unused machinery, had taken advantage of the helicopter's 3-week hiatus. And I was curious about the range of mud daubers, and a map shows that they can be found in every state in the United States as well as many of the provinces in Canada. From GeneralAviationNews.com, first flight after annual ends in crash from fuel exhaustion. This comes from an NTSB report. The accident flight was intended as a test flight after the Cessna 182's annual inspection. During the pre-flight inspection, the pilot visually checked the fuel and noted that there was less than he expected. While operating in the traffic pattern at the airport in Orlando, Florida, he experienced static on the radio and departed the airport area to troubleshoot. When he concluded these efforts and turned the airplane back toward the airport, the engine stopped producing power. Unable to restore power, he performed a forced landing to a street. The pilot avoided vehicle traffic and power lines. However, the airplane hit trees and a masonry fence, resulting in substantial damage to both wings. Examination of the wreckage by an FAA inspector revealed no fuel in the aircraft's fuel tanks. Probable cause: the pilot's improper fuel planning, which resulted in a total loss of engine power due to fuel exhaustion. From avweb.com, NTSB's safety investigation targets Part 135 operators. The NTSB has released the results of a special investigation involving more than 500 accidents between 2010 and 2022. The study focused on commercial operations involving commuter air carriers, air tour operators, air ambulance services, on-demand business charter flights, and some other operations. The NTSB reported it launched the investigation in 2022 following a cluster of safety issues involving Part 135 operators. Recommendations included 3 new safety measures issued to the FAA. The new recommendations started with unsafe loading conditions. The report cited 4 accidents involving single-engine aircraft where improper loading was identified. It recommends mandating that flight manifest and weight and balance documentation be recorded for all aircraft operated under Part 135. Next up was certification for dispatchers for certain operations. 12 accidents cited in the investigation timeframe were blamed, at least in part, on non-certified flight dispatchers. Finally, the investigation noted that improved flight data monitoring programs could provide Part 135 operators with objective information on how their pilots conduct flights, and a periodic review of such information could assist operators in detecting and correcting unsafe deviation from company standard operating procedures. The NTSB said that Special Investigation Report AIR-24-03, titled Safety and Industry Data Improvements for Part 135 Operations, is available, and there's a link to it in our show notes. And finally, from 7news.com.au, Seoul Air Traffic Controller was on break during Cannes' deadly stolen helicopter crash. A deadly flight in a stolen helicopter, which crashed into a luxury hotel on Cannes Esplanade in Australia, happened right under the nose of local air traffic control. A 7 News investigation revealed that the single air traffic controller on duty was taking a break on a recliner when a Nautilus Aviation ground crew employee, Blake Wilson, took the Robinson R-44 on an unauthorized flight just before 2 a.m. on August 12th. There were no breaches of responsibility, but the incident has raised questions about the staffing level at 24/7 airfields such as Cannes Airport. Wilson, 23, was killed when the helicopter crashed into the DoubleTree by Hilton in Cannes. 2 people, staying in the suite underneath the rooftop, were taken to Cannes Hospital suffering from emotional distress, while hundreds of people had to be evacuated from the hotel. An internal air services document reveals the Cannes tower was not in contact or aware of the helicopter's movement until police called regarding the crash. The document says, quote, the controller reported using a recliner chair to self-brake, which limited view of the airfield. At 1:42 a.m., the controller heard a click on the radio and got up but saw nothing, then sat back down. 5 minutes later, the rogue helicopter displayed on the tower's integrated tower automation suite screen. At 1:51 a.m., the controller heard a longer click and got up within 1 minute to check again, however did not observe anything on the display. The report states that 1:52 a.m. was also the time the helicopter disappeared from the screen. The internal document also states the controller, quote, did not sleep during this short break and attended to audio cues heard over the radio between 1:42 and 1:51 a.m. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, including our video of the week. And then later, we'll talk with Jim Hopp about tailwheel aircraft transition training. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. Congratulations to Sam Estes. He writes, just took my check ride at Santa Paula, which would be down in Southern California, and passed my single-engine land private. Just wanted to say thanks for all you do for the show. It's been a huge help, and wanted to thank you with a sign-up on Patreon and a one-time donation via PayPal. Looking forward to working on my IFR now. Congratulations to you, Sam. And now for our video of the week. This is the Martin Mars water bomber making its final flight from Port Alberni to the British Columbia Aviation Museum, and it's being escorted by the Canadian Forces Snowbirds. So it's a really great video, especially if you love seaplanes as I do. And to find it, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/video anytime you want to see our video of the week. And on that same page where you'll find a link to the video, you'll find links that you can use to sign up and support this show. So if you've been listening for a while and you find that you're getting value from it, and you've been thinking, I'll sign up to support the show when I get around to it someday, here's the perfect opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You can watch some great videos, and when you're done, sign up to support the show. There are 4 easy options. You can make a monthly donation via Patreon or PayPal. And if you sign up via Patreon, you'll get all kinds of goodies at the different support levels, starting at $8 a month. And for example, the $35 a month supporters get access to my online courses, and our $50 a month mega supporters get a signed copy of one of my books after 2 months. And you can also make a one-time donation via Venmo, Patreon, or Zelle. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. To get to that page where you see the video of the week and sign up to become a supporter, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/video. And for those of you who are thinking about working on your multi-engine rating, I just wanted to mention that the multi-engine pilot oral exam guide has been updated, and it's been updated by Jason Blair, who's taken over that series. You can find it at asa2fly.com or Amazon and many other places. So consider getting a copy of that. I always recommend the oral exam guides for just about any certificate or rating. They are really well done. And here's a quick note that there's a change to anybody who's looking to become a CFI. In the past, it was really easy to take the Fundamentals of Instruction FOI exam. You didn't need any kind of endorsement. You just went and took the test. Well, that's about to change. As of September 1st, the FAA is going to require that you get a CFI endorsement before taking that exam. And just a quick update on what I've been doing. On Monday, I spent the full day flying to Truckee Airport with my friend and fellow CFI Kumar, where we attended the free mountain flying course sponsored by the Truckee Airport. The ground portion was in the morning, and then we each flew with a local CFI in the afternoon. I flew with Chris Barbara, who's CEO of Mountain Lion Aviation, which is the Cirrus Training Center at Truckee. One of the things he pointed out is that runway 20 departures almost immediately enter an area of downdrafts, since the airport is east of and on the leeward side of the Sierra Mountains. He recommends an early left turn at whatever altitude a pilot is comfortable with to escape the downdrafts and enter an area of updrafts. And when I flew with him, I started that left turn probably when I was at 100 feet AGL or less, and a standard rate turn is about all that's required to get an appropriate heading to get you into an area where you'll hit some updrafts. Now, I should note that when I was flying, there were a few times when I got slow. One of the issues is that the surrounding mountains tend to create a false horizon that's higher than the actual horizon. And since as pilots, we know what the sight picture should look like relative to the horizon when we're looking outside, it's easy to pitch up too high as the mountains create this illusion of a higher than normal horizon. So, like all other aspects of flying, airspeed is life, and we all need to pay attention to it, particularly when we're flying in the mountains. Now, I also spent several hours visiting with airport staff while I was there and got a tour of the airport, and that's probably going to result in a magazine article, and I'll tell you more about that if and when that comes out. And it looks like next week I'm going to be on a trip flying with the owner of a new-to-him Cirrus SR-22T from California to Missouri, so I'll be gone at least a couple of days for that, and I'll tell you more about that afterwards. I also have 3 back-to-back VisionJet trips coming up in September, which may limit my time to produce new episodes, but I'll do the best I can. And here's a moving post that I saw on LinkedIn that I'm going to read to you. It really gets to the heart of what aviation is about, which is helping other people when we can. It was posted by Jordan Lamott, who I don't know. It says he's an international Gulfstream contract captain. And he wrote, "Yesterday I was tagged in a post on one of the pilots groups I'm on in Facebook that there was a terminally ill 12-year-old boy nearby at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles that wishes to meet a captain. I quickly sprung into action and coordinated everything I could do to make this little boy's dream come true of meeting a corporate jet captain. I was able to give him a few $100s worth of model planes, T-shirts, remove before flight key rings, some new sectionals, tack charts, Southwest AFD, and the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge to study from when he becomes a pilot like us. And I mentioned it's quite boring and he may fall asleep reading it." Several other pilots in the community rose up and donated a very sizable contribution to make this kid's dream come true. And he continues, "I also, with my various connections, being a former intern at United Airlines Flight Ops in Denver Training Center, in Chicago's Willis Tower, and one of the things I learned there was giving back to the community. I was able to secure him some real United Airlines captain wings and bars, trading cards from the LAX Chief Pilot's office for him to become an honorary United Airlines captain. AJ was in great spirits and loved every item he received, bringing nearly tears to his eyes from all the excitement. I also told him that once he gets healthier, that I'm going to take him up flying so he too can become a true pilot like the rest of us." Very heartwarming story. So big shout out to Jordan Lamott for what you've done there. And I hope it'll inspire other people to do similar kinds of things. Now here's an interesting story that comes from the AirForceTimes.com. It says B-1 bomber crash report blasts crew mistakes, culture of complacency. And I'll just mention that this is kind of an interesting article. You might want to check it out, even though it's not about general aviation. Some of the same things apply. It says a report is out now on the crash of a B-1 bomber that crashed in South Dakota in January. The nearly $451 million bomber was a total loss. The 4 members of the bomber's aircrew ejected during the crash. Two sustained injuries and were treated and released from a medical facility. It says the crew of a B-1B Lancer that crashed at Ellsworth Air Force Base failed to properly manage the bomber's airspeed and angle of attack while landing. The investigation, which Air Force Global Strike Command released on July 25th, also found that poor weather conditions, a lack of discipline, poor resource management and communication, and, quote, an organizational culture that tolerated decaying airmanship skills were among the other factors contributing to the January 4th crash. And I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. And just a quick update on the backpack closeout deal that I mentioned last week. Brian Schultz is closing out his inventory, and you can get one of his backpacks for half price, which is $99.50 plus shipping, if you use the promo code MAX. Now, in the past week, listeners have purchased about 40 of these. So if you're thinking of getting one, don't wait too long because this is a closeout deal. For the full description, listen to last week's episode 345. And to get the backpack, I've created an easy-to-remember URL for you, which is aviationnewstalk.com/backpack. And don't forget that if you're thinking of buying a Lightspeed headset, the brand I've been using for 25 years, they'll send a check to help support this show if you buy a new headset from them by first going to a special link that I've set up on my website. And that link is aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. And now see if you know any of these people who've signed up to support the show in the past week. Special thanks to new Patreon supporters Dan and to Charlie Farwell, and to one-time donations via PayPal, thanks to Randolph Lasota and to Andrew Schmertz, and thanks for a one-time donation via Venmo from Scott Sellers, and a one-time donation via Zelle from Carter Boswell. Thanks so very much for your support. Coming up next, our conversation with Jim Hopp about what it's like to transition into flying a tailwheel aircraft, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Jim Hopp. Jim is a flight instructor at the Palo Alto Airport near San Francisco, and he specializes in tailwheel training. He came to flight instruction after working in Silicon Valley. Now here's our conversation with Jim Hopp. Jim, welcome to the show. So great to have you here today.
Thanks. Great to be here, Max.
So you specialize in teaching in tailwheel. I know you teach in other aircraft as well. Why did you choose to do that? What's special about tailwheel to you?
I just love teaching in tailwheel airplanes. I feel like you're closer to the airplane. There's typically less stuff in the cockpit to watch, not a lot of glass panels. We often have a stick, which allows you to feel the airplane a little bit better. And then I also like the challenge of having to handle the airplane on the ground.
No question. Definitely more of a challenge on the ground for tailwheels. So let's talk about the ground. What's different on the ground when people are flying a tailwheel?
The big difference is the ground handling because of where the center of gravity is of the airplane relative to the main gear. So on a nose wheel airplane, the center of gravity is in front of the main gear. And what that means is since the center of gravity is where the airplane tends to pivot when it's turning on the ground, that if the airplane isn't tracking straight, if you've got a little bit of drift at touchdown, or if the nose isn't quite pointed in the direction you're moving, then the center of gravity is the airplane's going to jerk. If the wheels are behind the center of gravity, then the nose is going to tend to turn in the direction of that jerk, which essentially cancels out the jerk. But in a tailwheel airplane, the center of gravity is behind the main gear. And so if the airplane isn't tracking straight or is drifting right or left at touchdown, the center of gravity is going to try to continue moving in that direction. And because the main gear are in front of the CG, that means the CG is going to try to move out to the side of the airplane and cause a swerve and perhaps even a ground loop. I describe it as the difference between pulling a wagon, like in a nose gear airplane, where if the wagon starts to sway, it's going to start tracking straight because you're pulling it, versus pushing a wagon in a tailwheel airplane where if the wagon starts to sway, you need to counteract that sway immediately or the wagon's just going to turn off to the side. So that's the primary difference between tailwheel and nose gear airplanes. It's all about handling the airplane on the ground.
Yeah, certainly the tail always wants to try and get in front of the airplane, so it's a lot of work to keep it where it belongs. Talk about gyroscopic precession. That was one of the big differences I noticed when I was first doing takeoffs in tailwheel aircraft.
So, we have the usual three left turning tendencies of the airplane, and that applies to both nose gear and tailwheel airplanes. But the one you see in a tailwheel airplane at takeoff is gyroscopic precession. The prop is essentially a giant gyroscope. And so in a tailwheel airplane, we pick the tail up off the ground during the takeoff roll and accelerate on the main gear. And when that tail comes up, it exerts a force on that giant gyro at the front end of the airplane. Because the force on the gyro is manifested 90 degrees in the direction of rotation, that means that the airplane is going to want to turn left when the tail comes up. And so that is something that you don't have to deal with in a nose gear airplane at takeoff. And it just means you've got one more thing to think about when you're taking off. In fact, when I'm teaching takeoffs to new tailwheel students, we often do a 3-point takeoff, which is analogous to a soft field takeoff in a nose gear airplane, just so that they don't have to deal with gyroscopic precession just as they're learning how to fly a tailwheel airplane.
So talk a little bit more about that in terms of the right rudder pressure that you're applying as you go down the runway from kind of start to rotation.
Yeah, so as with any airplane, especially if it has a more powerful engine, as you bring the power in and the airplane starts to accelerate, the airplane is going to want to yaw left. And so you're going to have to feed in right rudder to keep the airplane tracking straight. And that's true in a tailwheel airplane as well. The additional thing is when you raise the tail during the takeoff roll, then the airplane is really going to want to yaw to the left. And so as that tail comes up, you really need to feed in more right rudder to continue it tracking straight. And then once the tail gets up to its horizontal position, then the gyroscopic precession goes away and you can relax a little bit of right rudder pressure.
Yeah, that I found interesting was that we've got increasing right rudder pressure and then decreasing and then increasing
Yes.
again. So there's a lot going on, but it helps to understand if you know why it's doing that and what's going to be happening.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about ground operations when we're taxiing around. What are some of the considerations there?
A couple of things are going on. First of all, in a tailwheel airplane, you typically, the tail's on the ground, and so you're sort of looking up. And depending on the model of airplane, you may or may not be able to see directly over the nose. So your visibility is going to be less, and it may even be obstructed to the point where you actually taxi in S turns, where you just turn the airplane right and left so you can get a peek at what's in front of you. That's true in some airplanes, not others. The other things that come into play are there's a weather vaning tendency. If you're taxiing in a crosswind and the wind is pushing on the side of the airplane, if there's a nose wheel on the airplane, then that's less of an issue because you've got that third point in front of the airplane that is resisting the weather vaning. However, in a tailwheel airplane where that third wheel is behind, you've got the entire side surface of the airplane, fuselage, that's being pushed. And because the center of gravity is behind that main gear and the airplane wants to turn around the center of gravity, the airplane is constantly trying to weather vane into the wind if you're taxiing in a crosswind. And so the classic example of Palo Alto is there's a 15-knot wind right down the runway, and you're taxiing on uniform towards the terminal at a 90-degree angle, and you're just having to hold right rudder the entire time to keep the airplane from weather vaning into the wind. And one final aspect is that because you've got the tail sitting lower than the fuselage of the airplane, the wings are actually at a positive angle of attack the entire time you're taxiing. And so you really need to pay attention to making sure that you're not taxiing fast enough to generate enough lift to make the airplane light, and that you're really pushing that tail, assuming it's a headwind, you're really pushing that tail down into the ground by holding full aft stick. Or conversely, if you're taxiing with a strong tailwind, you'd actually have the elevator stick all the way forward to keep the wind from being able to pick the tail. That's typically not an issue until you get over about 25 knots of tailwind, in which case you should be asking yourself why you're actually in an airplane. But it is something to be aware of.
Well, a lot of challenges when you're on the ground with a tailwheel aircraft. What about when you're in the air? How is that different?
They're the same. Airplanes are airplanes. Doesn't matter where that third wheel is in the air. Typically, a tailwheel airplane is an older design, so it'll often be draggier and have a bigger rudder. Certainly, when I fly with some pilots of modern nose gear airplanes, the engineers have done such a great job of tuning out the adverse yaw that you really can take your feet off the rudder pedals once you rotate and not really notice the adverse yaw. That is not true in a tailwheel airplane because it's an older, draggier airplane. you really can notice the adverse yaw. And so in the air, you're going to need to pay more attention to rudder usage to really keep the airplane flying well.
Well, let's talk about landings. We've got a couple different varieties, and once again, things are a little bit more challenging.
Yes, we have two landing types that we can do in the tailwheel airplanes. The first one that we teach is called a three-point landing, and that's where we try to touch down with all three landing gear simultaneously. Something that you absolutely don't want to do in a nose gear airplane. But because in the tailwheel airplane, the tail is designed to be lower than the main gear, we essentially have the airplane in the proper touchdown position while we're taxiing around the ground. In a three-point landing, just like in a nose gear airplane, we're going to make sure we have a stabilized approach. We're going to arrest the descent, let the airplane get into ground effect. And the difference is we're then going to pitch the airplane up slowly until we get into that three-point attitude. And then we're just going to hold that pitch attitude until the airplane touches down on all three wheels, as opposed to a nose gear airplane where you typically would want to touch down on the main gear and then hold the nose wheel off for a little bit. The other landing that we teach, which is unique to the tailwheel airplane, is a wheel landing. And that's where we actually touch down in a flat pitch attitude with both main gear on the ground at the same time, and the tail wheel is actually off the ground. And then we roll along for a while with the tail wheel off the ground, letting the airplane decelerate until we get slow enough that we can put the tail wheel on the ground and not have the airplane rotate again because of that positive angle of attack. It's a very subtle landing, and frankly, it's different, especially when pilots of nose gear airplanes are doing a tail wheel transition. They really struggle with it because you've always been taught never push the stick forward in the landing process. And here, what we're teaching you to do is when the main gear touch down, you push the stick forward. And so that requires a leap of faith, let's say, to do. The reason we do wheel landings is, number one, they're really cool. So it impresses everybody if you do a wheel landing. The second reason to do a wheel landing is you actually can land the airplane at a faster airspeed than essentially the stalling speed of the airplane. In gusty conditions or strong crosswind conditions, it allows you to get the airplane on the ground at a higher airspeed, so you have better control authority. Once you have those main gear on the ground, you then can lever against them with the controls as you track the center line. Once the airplane's slow enough, you put the tail on the ground. It's a subtle maneuver, but it teaches you better control of the airplane and gives you another arrow in your quiver when you're trying to decide how to handle conditions at a particular airport.
Yeah, I always found wheel landings kind of fun and also very satisfying. But I think that's a common aspect of flying in general. It's really fun to kind of master a particular skill and then move on and find other new skills to master. Now, you had a story about someone who was getting ready for a private check ride. Tell us about that.
I'm working with a student who is preparing for a private pilot check ride in the Santabria. She's never really flown any other type of airplane. And she's getting pretty close to her check ride, but she was really uncomfortable with short field landings and coming in at the proper altitude for this precision landing where you only have 200 feet to get the airplane down on the ground. And so I decided I would take her to a new airport that she'd not been to before and that would challenge her abilities to figure out when to turn base, how to descend, all these other things. She didn't have it locked in like she would at another airport. And so we went there, and I anticipated spending a lot of time talking about getting the airplane down to the proper airspeed and on the proper glide path and all that other stuff. Instead, she completely nailed every single short field landing at a challenging airport. And so I said, as we were coming back to our home airport, I said, "What did you have for breakfast this morning? You need to have that on the morning of your check ride because you were just on fire today." And she said, "Oh, I just decided to relax and have fun." And that was it. So, as flight instructors, we spend a lot of time saying you need to just relax and not be tense. It's hard to fly well if you're tense. And so she decided she was going to be relaxed, and she's totally nailing it. It was a wonderful moment.
Yeah, I always enjoy those moments when you see a breakthrough and you don't necessarily know why it occurred, but it's kind of fun to find out, okay, what did you do different? Do that exactly that way. Well, good. But let's talk a little bit about the regulations. What are the tailwheel regulations that apply?
To operate as a pilot in command of a tailwheel airplane, unless you were a PIC before 1997, you need a tailwheel endorsement from an authorized instructor, which says you've demonstrated competence in the operation of a tailwheel airplane, including wheel landings, if that's permitted. And then once you have that, The other remaining regulation is passenger carrying currency. We all know about the 90-day currency for passengers, but it turns out if you're going to carry passengers in a tailwheel airplane, then those 3 takeoffs and landings within the past 90 days must have been done to a full stop. As we say in the tailwheel community, you're not done flying a tailwheel airplane until it's tied down. So the FAA doesn't want you doing touch and goes for passenger currency. They all have to be full stop. And that's it. Tailwheel endorsement and PAX currency.
Yeah, and I guess the full stop makes sense because, as I recall, if you're doing a touch and go, that's pretty darn simple. The hard work is when it gets slow.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Yes. As the airplane decelerates, the control surfaces become less effective. Crosswinds become more important. You really need to be tracking the center line. Yes, it's important that you be able to handle the airplane to a full stop. And so when I'm working with someone in a tailwheel airplane, all of our initial landings are to a full stop because I need to see that they understand when the airplane gets slow, you need more control inputs.
Now, is flying a tailwheel every 90 days sufficient to maintain proficiency?
No. In fact, most clubs will insist on a 60-day currency at most for tailwheels. Because they're harder to handle on the ground, they're just not as forgiving of poor technique and things you can get away with on a nose gear airplane and not damage the airplane, you won't get away with in a tailwheel airplane.
Walk us through, if you would, what's involved in a tailwheel endorsement. What are all the kinds of things that you would go through with someone, and how many hours might they expect for a typical transition?
It really depends on whether they know what the rudder pedals are for in the airplane. If you know what the rudder pedals are for and you exhibit good crosswind technique, then the tailwheel transition is pretty straightforward. So the things that I'll start with are the differences between tailwheel and nose wheel and how they handle on the ground, really getting back to the center of gravity, talking about the weather vaning effect, talking about the crosswind controls. They're slightly different if you have a quartering headwind. And then going through a pre-flight, examining the tailwheel and how it works. Is it connected to the rudder pedals or not? Most of the tailwheel airplanes are cloth airplanes, if you can believe that. And so we talk about how do you inspect the fuselage and the wings to make sure that the cloth is still in good shape. Otherwise, it's a standard walk around. And then once we get into the airplane and are ready to taxi, it's talking about the rudder controls to keep the airplane tracking straight, especially in a crosswind. We will work on a 3-point takeoff to start because that's a simpler takeoff. Typically in the air, we'll work on rudder control exercises, especially if people have forgotten about adverse yaw. It really shows them how much adverse yaw there is in the airplane and the rudder controls. And then it's all about pattern work, basically getting comfortable with tracking center line on the final, being able to move the airplane left of the center line, right of the center line while you're keeping the nose pointed straight down the runway. One exercise I really like is getting into ground effect in the airplane on a long runway, using power to keep the airplane from touching down, and then basically sliding from side to side from the right edge of the runway to the left edge of the runway, keeping the nose pointed down the runway the entire time. It's a great exercise for teaching the interrelationship between the ailerons and the rudders. And then it's just landings. 3-point landings, how do you judge the 3-point attitude, holding it off? Crosswind correction once the airplane touches down is super important. As I'm sure you've seen in landings, Max, people often feel like once the wheels are on the ground, they're done and they can relax and start thinking about what they're doing after the flight. And that's just when things get really exciting in a tailwheel airplane. So really paying attention to those crosswind controls, aileron all the way into the wind if there's a crosswind, making sure the tail is firmly on the ground, and rudder to keep tracking straight down the runway. In terms of timing, 15 hours is pretty average, it seems to me. But again, it depends on how comfortable you are with the rudder pedals. If you take your feet off the rudders once you get in the air and never touch the rudder pedals again until you're taxiing, then it's going to take a little longer.
I remember my tailwheel instruction, which was before I became a CFI. And I think I did 2 flights in a Cessna 170. And I had not figured out the gyroscopic precession, and I was not doing a great job. So before the 3rd lesson, I got a copy of The Complete Tail Dragger Pilot, the yellow-covered book.
Oh, good, yes.
I read through that, and the very next takeoff was just amazingly great. And my instructor was shocked. He was like, how did you do this? What did you do different from last time? And certainly, like in many aspects of aviation, a little bit of knowledge and pre-study goes a long way to doing well when you get into the airplane.
Yes, I encourage my students to do chair flying, where they visualize I'm tracking the center line, and then I get hit with a gust of wind from the right. The airplane moves left. I'm going to put the stick to the right to move me back over the extended center line, and then I'm going to use whatever rudder is necessary to keep me pointed down the runway.
Chair flying is amazing. I think it's probably underrated, and pilots don't really recognize how effective it is. And it's pretty inexpensive as well. And it's almost as good as flying in the airplane, provided you've got the basic understanding of the fundamentals. Tell us where you teach and what kind of tailwheel aircraft they have that you teach in.
So I teach at Advantage Aviation in Palo Alto, California. We currently have 7 tailwheel airplanes. They're all Cetabrias. So we have the 7 ECA, which has the smaller motor, has a 115 horsepower motor. And we tend to start students off there because it has a little less power. And so you can't use power to mask poor decision making. And then we also have several 7 GCAA Cetabrias, which are exactly the same airframe, but just have a motor that has about 40% more horsepower. So they climb wonderfully. They have plenty of power for getting off short runways. They're really a fun airplane to fly.
Well, it sounds like you're having way too much fun.
Oh, yes.
Tell us where people can find out more about you and your work and get in contact with you.
Absolutely. Well, you can always go to advantage-aviation.com and look me up there on the instructor page, or you can just email me, jimhopp@gmail.com, and I'm happy to talk tailwheel flying anytime, anywhere.
Jim, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Oh, thanks, Max. I love talking about tailwheels. Thanks for having me on.
And my thanks to Jim for joining us here today. If you want to fly with him, go ahead and contact him at jimhopp@gmail.com. Now, if you've enjoyed the show and have any comments, you can email me by going to aviationnewstalk.com and clicking on Contact at the top of the page. And if you're getting value from this show, well, please support it by going to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And of course, please tell all of your friends about this show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down.